Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to CryptoBeast number 14. A very exciting episode today. I'm joined by David Livingstone, who's one of my favourite researchers and historians on the internet, someone who takes a comprehensive and exhaustive approach to research. His books are absolutely jam-packed with information and very useful for fellow researchers. So, David, welcome very much to my show.
Thanks for having me.
So you've been working on a book recently where you've been tracing, I guess, what's behind the scenes of some of the major political movements that we're seeing in our times.
Yes, it's my latest book. I've been researching this stuff for about 30 years now, and I had no idea that everything that I had been studying was to lead to this point. So I'm pretty astounded to see how much all the currents that I've been studying have led to the point of making Trump president.
Right, and just to highlight to my audience, a couple of your books that I've read were Black Terror, White Soldiers, and Transhumanism, the history of a dangerous idea. So you've very much been covering MK Ultra, the counterculture, the technology industry, even Burning Man's role in the evolution of transhumanism.
Yeah. Exactly.
And so you're saying that even beyond that, what you've found is kind of, I guess, the movements behind the scenes that have led to today's political situation. Yeah.
So what's really interesting is that when I wrote Black Terror, White Soldiers, it really covered the history of the Fascist International. And so it showed a lot of the history, but I didn't realize where it was going. So what's interesting, and then transhumanism covers the technology side, but those two things work together. So the Fascist International basically has used the technology, and what's interesting too is the role that discordism has played in the Trump campaign. And so that combined trajectory is what brought us all this together.
And do you have a title for the book yet?
Yes, it's called Ordo ab Chao.
Right, fantastic. And that is actually the motto of the Freemasons, isn't it?
Exactly, order out of chaos, which is what the whole plan is, right? And you could just see how much it accurately reflects what they're doing. So it's basically sowing disorder to create order.
Right. Are you familiar with Adam Curtis's documentary Hypernormalization?
Yes, absolutely. In fact,
go ahead.
He gave me a really important clue because he talks about Vladislav Surkov. And Vladislav Surkov has been partnering with Alexander Dugin, who's really the architect behind all this stuff.
This sense of ever-expanding madness has been unfurling all year, not just with ISIS, but with Russia and Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, Ebola, mistrust with politicians, with institutions, with the media, with cultural icons. There's chaos in the USA, chaos in Hong Kong, chaos in the news studio in Jordan. At times, the news has been so chaotic, the newsreaders themselves don't want to turn up and read it. Even seasoned reporters are chickening out live on air.
Nicholas, what does it say?
Against this sense that everything's sliding out of control, it's hard to know what to cling to or even what's going on. Here's a personal view from documentary filmmaker Adam Curtis, the man behind The Power of Nightmares and the forthcoming Bitter Lake, on the chaos that seems to be engulfing everything.
So much of the news this year has been hopeless, depressing, and above all, confusing. To which the only response is, oh dear. But what this film is going to suggest is that defeatist response has become a central part of a new system of political control. And to understand how this is happening, you have to look to Russia, and to a man called Vladislav Surkov, who is a hero of our time. Surkov is one of President Putin's advisors and has helped him maintain his power for 15 years. But he has done it in a very new way.
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
He came originally from the avant-garde art world, and those who have studied his career say that what Surkov has done is import ideas from conceptual art into the very heart of politics. His aim is to undermine people's perception of the world, so they never know what is really happening. Surkov turned Russian politics into a bewildering, constantly changing piece of theatre. He sponsored all kinds of groups, from neo-Nazi skinheads to liberal human rights groups. He even backed parties that were opposed to President Putin. But the key thing was that Surkov then let it be known that this was what he was doing, which meant that no one was sure what was real or fake. As one journalist put it, it's a strategy of power that keeps any opposition constantly confused, a ceaseless shape-shifting that is unstoppable because it's indefinable.
And so if I could sort of summarize the point that's being made in that documentary very briefly, it's a controlled strategy of chaos and manipulating the media and PR events, not necessarily to disseminate information directly, but to just keep things shifting and moving around and chaotic. And then out of that environment of chaotic, it's almost like chaos magic, isn't it? That these discordians can move in and then, they can steer events the way they are going without the same ability of their enemies to watch what they're doing.
Yeah. It makes, I was just thinking on the way here, how much I've been realizing how, because the whole point here is to fulfill the book of Revelation. And so of course to bring about the advent of the Antichrist. And people think of the end times as being sort of a time of mainly of war, disease, and environmental upheaval. But really, what I'm starting to recognize is that it's the end times is actually an era of unreality, so an era of post-truth, and so this is pretty much what the Discordians are striving for, is an era when when the truth is that there is no truth. So I think so that's it creates, it's basically a collective insanity where everybody gives up on the possibility of truth and of reality.
And it's very interesting to me that the internet seems to be used as the main weapon to deliver this world. I mean, it's very much a two-edged sword that, as researchers, we use it to get to the truth. But the designers and architects of the system, quite possibly had this in mind from the very beginning.
It would seem that they did, yeah.
So which came first out of the Fascists International or the Discordians?
The Fascists International.
And is this linked to, there was a whole bunch of these international movements that started, I believe, in the 19th century, such as there was a Communist International, there was a bunch of youth revolutions. Are these movements all linked together?
Well, what's really fascinating is that, it seems like the crucial event is the Bolshevik Revolution. And so what happens is that there's a movement called the Aufbau, and it's a movement comprised of white Russians who are opposed to the Bolshevik regime. And one of the principal agents of this movement is a guy named Boris Brassel. And so there's an excellent book by, I can't remember his name, his last name is Kellogg, about the Aufbau and about basically the Russian origin of the Nazi movement. So the Aufbau were actually the source of the Nazi ideology. And who were Russian emigres living in various parts of Europe, and they went to Germany. The ones that they influenced in particular were Alfred Rosenberg, who was a member of the Aufbau. Karl Haushofer was an Aufbau member. And so this guy, Boris Brassel, who is basically a crypto Jew and basically a double agent. And he's also working with another guy named Sidney Riley. And Sidney Riley, again,
This is the guy known as Riley, Ace of Spies, yeah?
The Ace of Spies. He's the guy that Ian Fleming based his James Bond character on. So what's interesting is that these guys all work for, is the full name William Wiseman? William Wiseman, I think, who's head of British intelligence, and connected with Colonel House. So basically, these guys are roundtable strategists that are using these anti-Bolsheviks specifically to spread the notion of a Jewish conspiracy. So this is something I've dealt with before in Black Terror White Soldiers, that I show that the protocols of Zion were a product of the Memphis and Mizraim Lodge and Egyptian Freemasonry. So
Right.
Boris Brassel basically comes out of that movement, and he's the main guy who's chiefly responsible for the dissemination of the protocols. He's the one who brings them to the United States and coordinates with Henry Ford for their publication in English. And so Boris Brassel now is also a member of the Shikshini Knights of Malta. This is basically an order of St. John. They claim to be inheritors of a Russian order of St. John, and but they're basically a Masonic order. And so that basically right there is the core, is the kernel out of which the entire American far right emerges.
You mentioned Henry Ford, and he obviously wrote the book The International Jew, which came out at sort of around the same time as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Also very critical of this Jewish conspiracy. Was he connected to any of these Masonic lodges?
I believe he was a Mason. He was also interested in theosophy. But most importantly, he was working very closely with Boris Brassel and all these Shikshini Knights. So all these guys are basically agents of the Third Reich. There's a number of Boris Brassel is like the one character that connects all these people. So he's connected to Leslie Fry, Father Laughlin, Gerald L.K. Smith, Merwin K. Hart, basically all the people who founded the America First Committee. And and working basically, it's a combination of Shikshini Knights, members of the Klan, members of the Silver Shirts, who then basically came together to form the America First Committee. And again, that's why it's no accident that Donald Trump specifically referred to America First multiple times in his inauguration speech, because he was deliberately referring to this tradition. America First is actually a Klan slogan.
Really?
Yeah.
And the Klan, you see that as really one of these several Templar orders, such as the Knights of Malta, that have been set up as branches of these Masonic lodges.
Well, it's a whole lot to try to make sense of, but so I'm still trying to understand it, but it all goes back to the Aryan race, right? So the Aryan race it's a concept. It's a Kabbalistic concept, despite the fact that it's perceived as white supremacist. It's basically rooted in Scottish Rite Freemasonry. That seems to be what the underlying core is. So it seems that all these various branches emerge out of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. So Scottish Rite Freemasonry, the basis of its ideology is this concept of the Asian Kabbalah. So it's the idea that the Kabbalah didn't originate amongst the Jews. It originated long before them, amongst the Aryans. And the Aryans lived on Atlantis, where they interbred with the sons of God of the Bible, or ancient aliens, as they're known popularly right now, extraterrestrials. And they interbred with them and created a race, a superior race known as the Aryans. And to them, they taught the so-called ancient wisdom. When this is supposed to have taken place at the time of Genesis, at the time of the flood. So the sinking of Atlantis is supposed to be the flood. The Aryans escape, land in the mountains of Asia, and from there they spread to various parts of the world, and they spread their ancient wisdom. One of the most important ones is, and this is what Blavatsky explained, is that the Aryans was responsible for the spread of Bon shamanism, which is, she says in her language, is that it's the only true inheritance of the ancient Aryan tradition of magic, and that Bon shamanism then feeds into Tibetan Buddhism. So Tibetan Buddhism is not Buddhism; it's a heretical, very mystical, basically satanic branch of Buddhism. And so that's the nature of that connection. So
would this be the Great White Brotherhood that Blavatsky and Theosophy talk about? Is
all that nonsense.
Aryan group,
yeah. So it's the king of the world living in Shambhala, and the king of the world is Satan. She calls him Sanat Kumara, but she says he's the same that Christians call Satan. and from there he rules the world. So that's very closely connected to the Agartha myth, which leads into synarchism. But Albert Pike was a member of the Theosophical Society, and he was also apparently one of the original founders of the clan. So that's where you
right. And so and then we also have the Henry Ford potentially linked to Theosophy being there against the Jews. I did a previous show with Joe Atwell talking about the role of the Quatuor Coronati Lodge, basically the experimental research lodge of Freemasonry, and how a lot of that was being fed into Blavatsky, and almost simultaneously with the moves to resurrect Jerusalem and create this nation of Israel, which I see very much as a Freemasonic project.
Yeah. So I had go ahead.
No, after you.
Well, it's just I had a hint when I was reading. I had an inkling when I was reading a book about Hegel's mysticism that there was a tendency to look for interpretations of the Book of Revelation. So I had a sort of a suspicion that the Book of Revelation might likely be the blueprint. And it's funny that how long I've known of Albert Pike's morals and dogma, that it's only recently that I finally was able to read and see what he's talking about. And he basically, the reason why that St. John is the patron saint of Freemasonry is because St. John is the author of the Book of Revelation. So according to Albert Pike, the Book of Revelation is a Kabbalistic book, and it is the blueprint and which they follow, and it's the great work of Freemasonry to fulfill the Book of Revelation. So this is why people are looking to the book as and comparing it to political events, thinking that they're seeing a fulfillment of prophecy when actually it's not. It's a deliberate fulfillment. It's a deliberate carrying out of the plans outlined in the Book of Revelation.
Right. Yeah. And if it looks like the fulfillment of prophecy, it's because it's the fulfillment of the blueprint, and part of the blueprint was to make it look like prophecy. And in many ways, I see the same thing in 1984 and also Brave New World. So the bit of a modus operandi of these characters of this is how they like to broadcast their intentions in these multi-generational books.
Exactly. So what's interesting about go ahead.
No, after you, please.
Well, what's interesting about Pike is that the Book of Revelation is the last book to have been entered into the Bible. It wasn't entered until somewhere around 400 AD, so even long after the Nicene Council and after a lot of controversy. So some of the Christian fathers rejected it, and some of them approved of it. So it was only after some time that it was finally included in the New Testament. And but one of the authors, Corinthus, I think is Cerinthus, I can't remember his name exactly, but he's a Gnostic who was actually reputed to have written the Book of Revelation. And that's exactly what Albert Pike says. So even Albert Pike recognizes that the Book of Revelation is a Gnostic book.
Right. So this fed into the Bolshevik Revolution.
Right. And Boris Brassel, who then works to spread the protocols of Zion, comes to the United States, helps to establish the Six City Knights, and out of that you have all the characters that are the founders of the America First Committee, and that's the birth of the American Rite, and from there, that's where the whole story begins.
Okay, and but so maybe bring us along this path a little bit more, because out of this group, or this sort of evolutionary branch, if you like, we get the John Birch Society. Is that right?
Exactly. So that's what all these branches come out of. So what's consistent throughout this whole period is the maintenance of this concept of a worldwide Jewish and communist conspiracy. So this perpetuation of this fear of a communist threat is what's used all along as a carrot at the end of the stick to carry forward a fascist agenda. And the funny thing is that for the most part, they will come out and name, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, the Federal Reserve. But the whole time, it's basically a manipulated, controlled opposition.
Now, if you look sort of further up the pyramid if you like, where you sort of see the role of the Rothschilds coming into the world banking system a few hundred years ago. Was they didn't come in at the top of the pyramid. They basically came in as the Hofjude and the court factors for the wealthy European black nobility. And in your own research, is that sort of still how you see the power structure today, that it isn't Jews run the world, it's these wealthy oligarchical bankers run the world, and the Jews are kind of set up, scapegoated, if you like, to take the blame for all of this stuff?
Well, yeah, it's a really curious thing. There's a great article I just read, an opinion piece in the New York Times. It's pretty much a left-leaning sort of, it's still pro-Zionist left-leaning piece, but basically he says that the Jews have enemies, but there's also anti-Semitic Jews. I can't remember exactly what his language is, but so this is kind of the reality, right? I think I've mentioned this many times before. I hate to repeat myself, but basically people forget that Judaism is a religion, and like every religion, it's got its sects and schisms. So, just how we're not surprised to find Sunni Muslims at war with Shia Muslims, we shouldn't be surprised that there's potentially internal struggles inside of Judaism as well. So it really goes back to Shabbatai Zvi. Really, this really seems to be the underlying current the whole way through, and basically this ongoing conflict between Orthodox Judaism and Sabbatarian, basically satanic Kabbalistic Judaism. And what seems to have happened is that in very recent times, the Sabbatarians have effectively taken hold, and that's largely attributable to the wealth of families like the Rothschilds. And so they've been able to bankroll, various organizations like, all the major families were Sabbatarians, like the Kuhn-Loeb family, the Schiff family, the Warburg family. And these are the guys who funded the Bolshevik Revolution, funded the Nazis, funded the Federal Reserve, did most of the actions. And then, so what's curious, I think what matters is that it's Theodor Herzl who explained the strategy, and he said that the anti-Semite would be their best friends. So the strategy, anti-Semitism is necessary. It's the only way to advance the Zionist cause. So they need to create the perception that the Jews, and by that, the fabricated version of Jews as a people, as opposed to Jews as a religion, are being persecuted. And if they can do that, then they can continue to hide their deviousness behind this mask or false label of anti-Semitism, and continue to justify the support of the United States, most importantly. So
yeah, I think there's some really amazing points that you're making there, but one of them is definitely this idea that the Jew is not one group, that there are sects and factions and they're at war with each other, and also that anti-Semitism becomes a weapon that can be used against their political opponents, including some of whom may actually be Jewish. Yeah. This is very much the Hegelian dialectic playing out of,
exactly.
You create the synthesis and the antithesis. And I just want to pick up on something that you mentioned earlier, which was the mysticism of Hegel. So Hegel was someone who was a servant of this group, and his theories were influential, but he was working for them rather than the other way around.
Absolutely, yeah. Of course, the thing is that even Sabbatarianism goes back to the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria. And so the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria is basically the idea that humanity is God coming to know itself. So the Messiah is the first man who is able to recognize, quote unquote, that he is God. So that's Hegel's philosophy. So the important thing here is that that's how the whole notion of progress in the first place has entered into Western culture. So all the people who are responsible for the Western concept of progress were all Illuminati, like Cocotte in particular, and Hegel is another important exponent. But at the same time, it's also millenarianism, right? So it's also Hegel and Marx. They're both millenarian doctrines. They're just atheistic millenarian doctrines, just like the New Age movement is. All these movements have their source in the attempt to fulfill Bible prophecy, but it's gotten to the point where it's become a heresy that's so removed from the original teachings that any relation to the role of God or prophets has been almost, in any religious language, has been removed. But it's still fundamentally, it's a millenarian movement, and that's again going back to the concept of the Third Reich. The Nazis were a millenarian movement again, aiming to fulfill the 1,000-year reign of Christ, or the Third Reich, as they called it.
Yeah, and certainly from my own research, there's a lot of evidence to show that they're still a very powerful faction and still fulfilling that vision.
Very much so.
Now, just another point I wanted to pick up on is that you said that this is basically coming down to the Sabbatarians versus the Orthodox within Judaism. Yeah. Now, Trump's daughter is married into the Orthodox side. That's correct, yeah?
Well, this is what's throwing people off. So I don't know if this is intentional, but they're not Orthodox. They're the Shabbat Lubavitchers.
Okay, so they maybe they look like the Orthodox Jews, but in fact they're not.
They call themselves Orthodox Jews, but they're not.
Right.
So the Hasidic movement, interestingly, if you look, this is what I trace in my new book. If you look at the history of the Hasidic movement, it emerged as the Sabbatean movement was being submerged. So it's basically a renewed manifestation of the Sabbatean movement.
Right, similar to how as soon as the Jesuits got oppressed, the Illuminati rose up.
Exactly, something like that. It's the new face.
Okay, that's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So we're maybe leaping ahead a little bit. Let's come back to the America First Society, and that gave birth to the John Birch. What are some of the other groups that spawned out of that?
Yeah, so the America First Committee was founded in 1940. Its purpose, aligning with the foreign policy of Germany, was to keep America out of the war. And so it was receiving funds from Nazi Germany, and again, being operated by various Nazi agents. One very interesting person is a guy named George Sylvester Virich, and he's the guy who worked with Aleister Crowley for the Fatherland magazine during World War I, making what Crowley claimed was black propaganda. And so this George Sylvester Virich is a fascinating character. He just connects everybody. And anyways, too many names to mention. They might come back to it later. So out of the America First Committee, the first important outgrowth is what's called the American Security Council. So what's interesting is the American Security Council is what's called the heart of the military-industrial complex. And that's what this is really all about. So, there's many levels of motivation, maybe the word, but one of the reasons for the promotion of this so-called communist threat, and if you look a little deeper behind it, it's supposed to be a Jewish communist threat, is to justify military spending to feed the military-industrial complex.
Right.
So it's really out of these circles that you get. So first, most importantly, there's the John Birch Society, but also the Liberty Lobby. There is also the National States' Rights Party. There's the American Nazi Party, George Lincoln Rockwell. And these are the American branches of the Fascists International, with links to the Italian MSI, to the French OAS. Behind it all is Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite commando.
Right.
And then we get to another interesting group is called Le Cercle. And Le Cercle was founded, I think, somewhere around 1954, the same year as the first Bilderberger meeting, by two synarchists and founders of the Bilderberg Their names are Antoine Pinet and Jean Violet. I hope I got his first name right. I think it's Jean Violet. So the sect then becomes really the parent umbrella organization of all of this stuff. And made up, I said.
This is sort of like a secret society amongst the high-level intelligence community in Europe.
Yeah, it's made up of Knights of Malta. An important member is Otto von Habsburg. Knights of Malta, Opus Dei, and the world's intelligence agencies, and then people like Kissinger, William Casey, William Colby, people like that. So, then there's numerous other branches. There's importantly like the World Anti-Communist League. So if we come back, move forward a little bit. These are
can I just pause you for 1 second before we move forward? Would you mind to give the audience a definition of cynicism?
Right. So, cynicism is a very curious tradition, and so both the founders of the sect were synarchists, and this is where we can come back to Alexander Dugin, who's the architect of all this stuff. So, synarchism begins with a guy named Saint Yves d'Alred. He was a French mystic. He was a Martinist, and he claimed that he had made contact through telepathically with Agartha. So Agartha is an interesting case because Agartha is related to Asgard, which is the home of Odin. So this takes us back to the Khazars, the Gog and Magog, and so on and so forth. But the whole idea that Odin originated in southern Ukraine and then moved into Scandinavia, and that's the source of the Aryan race, and of course Nazi paganism. And so in Agartha, which is related very much to Blavatsky's Shambhala, that's where they practice a political system known as synarchism. And the idea of synarchism is that a society should be run by politicians, but the politicians derive their advice from a priest class who are in contact with the quote unquote gods. So this is basically the same kind of ascended masters that Blavatsky was in contact with, or discarnate entities. So that's the whole point, right? That's what mysticism is. It's about making contact with demonic spirits and supposedly deriving wisdom from them.
And so if we could sort of infer from that, it's not just the Kabbalists that are into this stuff. It's, the von Habsburgs, some of the wealthiest families in the world, and it's Knights of Malta, and it's people that are at the heads of these intelligence agencies. This is, at the core of what's driving them is these, quite unusual spiritual beliefs.
It really is, yeah. So I think the underlying body is the Scottish Rite Freemasonry, which connects it.
Right.
So the very curious case, if I am not taking this too far off a tangent, is that the guy that introduced Saint Yves to synarchism is a guy, he named himself in that case Haji Sharif. And Haji Sharif is the same as this guy named Jamal Afghani, who was one of Blavatsky's ascended masters. Right. And Jamal Afghani is also the founder of what's called the Salafi schism of Islam, out of which emerged the Muslim Brotherhood, and which has since it's pretty much become the official ideology of the Saudi state. It's called Wahhabism, but they're one and the same at this point.
Wow! So we can trace all of these things back to this. We go back to
exactly right. So out of synarchism, there's three important people who come from that tradition, and it goes hand in hand with traditionalism, and Martinism. So the first person is René Guénon, a French philosopher who converted to Islam. He converted to Islam because he believed that exoteric religions were just the husk, and that all religions shared a single core, an esoteric core. So it didn't matter which religion you picked outwardly, because if you followed the mystical tradition of either, you're basically following the same path. So whether it's Sufism or Gnosticism or Kabbalah or whatever, it's all the same. It's all the same thing, which of course can be proven to be true. After him comes Julius Evola. And Julius Evola is an Italian fascist philosopher and who inspired the Gladio networks. And after him is Alexander Dugin in our time. And Alexander Dugin is the architect of the Russian interference mission.
Yeah, and he's sort of considered to be, Putin's not so secret weapon, right? That he's not just connected to people doing this in the United States, but this has become very much part of the way modern Russia is managed today.
Yeah. So what's really fascinating is how the prophecies that they are working to fulfill. So if you look at the Synarchists were responsible for the formulation of the Priory of Zion mythos. And that was developed by Pierre Perlantar. It was written about in Holy Blood, Holy Grail by Lee Bajantan Lincoln, and then repopularized by Dan Brown. And there's an excellent book by Picknett and Prince. They're the same authors who wrote Stargate Conspiracy.
Yep.
And they show the extensive links between the Priory Zion mythmakers and the Synarchist organizations. So what their goal, again, is to fulfill end times prophecy. And there's the two prophecies that they're following in particular, and that's the Secrets of Fatima and the prophecies of Nostradamus. Are you familiar with the Secrets of Fatima?
Yeah, so this was some young children saw a vision of a being in the sky. Yeah. And gave them some messages about, what was the times to come that would signify the end of the world.
Exactly. So one of the most important components of that revelation was the consecration of Russia. So what I trace in my book is that if you look at the people who were, first of all, this whole worship of Mary is rooted in the mysticism of Jacob Frank. Okay. So Jacob Frank's movement started with the worship of the Black Madonna in Poland. And the Black Madonna is, there's some legend that she turned black for some kind of, as a miracle or whatever. But the Black Madonna is the Shekinah of the Kabbalah. So it's the female side of God. This goes back to the Song of Solomon, where she says, "I am black, but I am beautiful." So this is the traditional worship of evil that goes back for thousands of years, personified as a black goddess. The black not as symbolizes skin color, but black has evil black. And so that's where this Marian tradition comes from. And so there's a really interesting guy. He calls himself Jewish Christian, who's done genealogical work that shows that the Sabbatarian origin of a lot of the 20th century popes. So when you look at the various popes that were responsible for basically legitimizing the worship, the acceptance of the Secrets of Fatima and the worship of Mary, they were all popes who have Sabbatarian origins. And the most important among them is Pope John Paul II. And so these are all the guys who are also responsible for Vatican II. This is a strategy that goes back to the Mazzini's Alta Vendita, the attempt to plant an Illuminati, quote unquote, Illuminati Pope as the head of the church. And that begins with a guy named Cardinal Rampolla, who is claimed by the OTO, Alice Crowley's OTO, as being one of their members. And that begins, so that begins a chain of consecrations that slowly brings in various secretly Masonic agents inside the Vatican who ultimately who put forward Vatican II to basically create the break and create a new Masonic church.
Well, and so I think it's probably safe to say that the Vatican has been completely infested with these Illuminati now, if it wasn't 100 years ago.
Yeah, well, I mean, especially since John Paul. Well, I mean, yeah, since various posts, but John Paul II was really very much Illuminati Pope, working closely with the CIA to destabilize Poland and all kinds of stuff, and to fulfill. It was all part of fulfilling the consecration, the prophecy of the consecration of Russia.
Now, Putin is very closely allied, I believe, with the Russian Orthodox Church. How do they fit into this picture?
So this is the synarchist or traditionalist strategy where religion is seen as being a good binding cause to unite people together. So this is a clash of civilizations, and it's exactly as Huntington predicted, that there would be a Catholic world, that the borders of the old Soviet Union would disintegrate, and it would be replaced by a new union of Orthodox peoples. So it would seem that Dugin is basically following that as a playbook, and so it has nothing to do with genuine adherence to Orthodox Christianity. It's just a means to an end. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to fulfill what the prophecy of what they call the Third Realm.
Yeah, and that's part of rebuilding the Third Temple as well, right?
It's not directly related, but it's in preparation for the coming of the Antichrist. So basically, in his own words, Dugin says that the end times is not just a prophecy that we sit back and watch. It's a task. It's a responsibility that we have to help make happen. So Dugin's mentor is a guy named Jean Parvulescu. So there's two guys who are the most. It's amazing that these guys are completely unknown, and these are the guys who shaped history. And it's Jean Parvulescu and Raymond Abellio, two French very high-ranking mystics. These are the guys who are simultaneously responsible for the creation of the Priory of Zion mythos and advancing this importance of the secrets of Fatima. And so these guys were part of the network, the Synarchist network, of the Synarchist Pact. And that Synarchist group behind the Synarchist Pact were the ones who were responsible for the pan-European union of Coudenhove-Kalergi and Otto von Habsburg, which eventually then evolves into the European Union.
Yeah, commonly known as the Kalergi Plan.
Well, the Kalergi Plan is basically, it's a different disinformation campaign that's designed to claim that the flood of immigrants to Europe is part of this mongrelization plan. But that's part of the whole fascist strategy.
Okay, yeah. Can you elaborate on that a bit more? So part of the fascist strategy is to encourage the open borders and widespread immigration.
The fascist strategy is always the same. It's always been the same. So it's picking a scapegoat and then using that to encourage nationalism, and then that nationalism allows them to carry forward their fascist agenda. And that's why it always goes back to the protocols of Zion, the stigmatization of Jews, and now it's basically immigrants and Muslims. So it's just the same strategy. That's why you can see it happening all over. That's why it's the same. That's why Trump is doing. That's what's happening in Hungary. That's what's happening in Greece. That's what's happening in various places. And everywhere you look in those countries, it tends to be Dugin behind it and with Russian backing.
Right, and this is a model that has been proven to work in the past, and by studying history, we see these patterns that come back and repeat it again, and the pattern certainly of Trump is promoting ultranationalism, going to these rallies, having massive crowds turning out at the rallies where he speaks in quite simple language. He repeats these simple concepts several times to get them across. And the cameras show the screaming fans. we saw all of this with the rise of Hitler, right? And
Exactly.
even concomitant with economic success, and the economy's booming, and the roads and the bridges are getting fixed, and everything like that.
It's the easiest thing to use. And so what's interesting is that it's fear and hatred, right? The easiest tools. But that's a tradition that's endemic to the United States, and it goes back to the Klan. So that's why that division was always there. It was never healed. And so it's still the division of North and the South, which is the racist South and the liberal North. And it's the racist South basically largely through the influence of the Klan. And this is why they call it the Southern Strategy, because these manipulators know that they just need to say the right words and they will get the vote. They can put in their candidate in place and advance their agenda. And that's why Trump is the first such candidate in a long time. Because when you look at the people who are behind his campaign, guys like Paul Manafort and Roger Stone, those guys are the veterans of the Southern Strategy. And Paul Manafort was the guy who was responsible for Reagan's Southern Strategy campaign.
Right, and Roger Stone, of course, goes back to Nixon. He has a giant tattoo of Nixon on his back.
Yeah,
and a frequent guest and collaborator of Alex Jones. So let's talk a little bit about how Alex Jones ties into all of this, and into the Discordians as well.
Well, so Alex Jones he's a classic example. There's been many Alex Joneses over the years. So like there's Father Coughlin and Joel A.K. Smith, and these guys have been there's the Scoos, Cleon Scoos, and all these guys. It's the same MO for the last 70 years. It's always the same concept. It's basically claiming to expose this communist conspiracy, and always the same characters. Because you look at where Alex Jones got his education with the John Birch Society. And he claims himself that he's got all kinds of intelligence connections and background, and in his family. And, what was really particularly fascinating is that he said that he comes from a family of Rosicrucians who arrived in the United States on the Mayflower. And that is the key. That's the key.
Right.
He says that he is from the real Illuminati, not the false Illuminati.
Yeah, and so by that, does that mean Sabbatarians? Is that really what the code word is for?
Well, I'm not sure, because it's hard to tell, at what level of complicity these guys operate in, right? So are they dupes or are they manipulators? And so a guy like Alex Jones, I don't know, but what's clear is that his agenda has been, because we're so grateful for the advent of the internet because of how much information is put to our disposal. But like you mentioned at the beginning, it's been used for opposite purposes, right? Trump has been put in power because of the internet, which has been used to specifically, like the majority, Trump's base is a base of conspiracy cons or victims, right? Like dupes of false conspiracy theories, misleading conspiracy theories. And that's all that's been, so Alex Jones is very much a key factor in developing that. And Alex Jones even claims that he founded the Tea Party movement with Ron Paul.
Yeah, I've heard him make that claim, yep.
Yeah. So it's a classic case.
So obviously conspiracies are real, and if you're a researcher of history, then you're a researcher of conspiracy. And that's just the nature of it.
Yep.
What I'm seeing at the moment and recently that causes me a bit of concern, there's all these different channels on YouTube that are truther channels trying to get to the bottom of conspiracies, and amongst them there seem to be people who are provocateurs. They're either paid operatives or they're part of a group with an agenda. And what they're doing is they're mixing the classic tactic of muddying the waters. They mix in provable, true information with their own theories, and they lead the audience away. It's sort of like the tale of the Pied Piper.
Yeah. What's amazing about the election of Trump is that it's basically exposed everybody. It's clear that everybody, all the alternative media were fronts for disinformation. So not only Alex Jones, but obviously Breitbart and garbage like that, and then the Daily Caller. That's all the right wing stuff, but all the left wing stuff as well too, like Global Research, which I used to follow somewhat. Some of my articles were published on there, but all these guys are basically, I don't know if they're knowingly or not, but agents of Russian propaganda. What's really interesting too is William Engdahl and his connections with Russia, and indirectly to Dugin as well.
Really?
And this is a classic example of left-wing fascism, and that's really what it comes down to. If this is where Dugin gets his start. Dugin gets his start with being mentored by Jean Parvulescu, who's he's a member of this organization or movement called the Nouvelle Droite, which is the French New Right, and the leader of the organization is called GRECE, and it's a fascist group connected in every way to all like the classic typical synarchists and OAS agents, and what's his name? Arthur Kessler. He was a member,
right?
And I can't remember all of the people who are involved, but basically then becomes the crucible for the European right, and that's where Jean Parvulescu comes from.
And the Le Circle group, are they linked to this organization?
They are indirectly. So the self is much more higher level up. They are more tied with the intelligence agencies. So these other organizations like Nouvelle Droite, they're more like advocates, philosophers, intellectuals, that kind of a thing. But I mean, they all work together somehow, I guess, right? So they all serve a shared purpose. But yeah,
and then after World War II, with the Operation Gladio, that seems to have been an outbreak of this Fascist International group as well.
Absolutely, it's central to it.
Yeah, and so their strategy of creating fake terror events and then blaming it on the bad guy to achieve their political agenda. We saw that playing out in Europe for decades and decades, but that really seems to be what we see on the world stage now with this war on terror. And domestically with so many of these FBI-connected events that seem to happen and no one can really explain it, but we just move on because the next event comes.
Yeah.
I wonder, first of all, would you mind to give us a definition of fascism? Because there's some competing ideas about what it means.
Yeah. It's really hard to find a definition on fascism. Simply put, fascism is hierarchy. So it's the belief that humans basically organize naturally in a hierarchy. But the problem, which is true, the problem is, according to fascist interpretation, it's also a hierarchy of worth. So the higher you are on the scale, the better you are as a human being, so that the elite are the only ones entitled to rule. And the problem is that since the ones lower down are so stupid that you don't really want them to be voting, you want the elite to be selecting themselves, and that's basically it.
Right.
So that's why it's anti-democratic, and that's not my observation. That's in their own language.
Yeah, and what about the aspect of it that's the merger between the state and corporations?
Yeah, so exactly, that's fundamentally it. So it's basically why
the politicians become agents of the corporations and the bankers, essentially.
Yeah, and the other way around, right? So basically, the corporations become the state.
Yeah, and
the leaders of the corporations should apparently run the state, and that's where neoliberalism comes from, and that's what their true agenda is.
Right. Now, what about the links between Trump and Dugin?
Yeah, so this is a fascinating story here. So Lesseps was responsible for particularly groups like the Heritage Foundation, founded by Paul Weyrich and Adolf Kurs, and then Paul Weyrich was also one of the founders of the Moral Majority, and that's really where you get and Jesse Helms and all kinds of crazy characters. Terry Dolan, I think, as well. And so that's really the birth of, well, it's not the birth, it's the exploitation of Christianity to advance the right-wing agenda goes back to the Liberty League. But in modern times, the beginning is with Weyrich's moral majority. And so one of the founders is Terry Dolan, who was working with Roger Stone. And so these guys, Paul Manafort, Terry Dolan, Lee Atwater, all these guys are what are called Arthur's kids. They are all proteges of Arthur J. Finkelstein. This is a guy who's in the Hall of Fame of politics. He's what do they call him? The Merchant of Venom. So he's really the originator of dirty tricks politics. And so that's where all these guys got schooled. So what's interesting is that, of course, he's a close friend with Netanyahu, as they all are.
Right.
So back in 1987, there's a fascinating article online by Greg Unger. So Greg Unger has written a book about it. Greg Unger calls the election the greatest intelligence operation in modern times. And so in 1987, Leonard Lauder arranges a meeting with the ambassador to Russia. His name is, I think that position is correct. His name is Dubinin. And Donald Trump raves about it in his book, about how much he impressed this guy and that he invited him to go to Russia. So as has been the case many times, Trump goes to Moscow, supposedly there to discuss the building of Trump Tower. He's done that, I think, a total of 5 times. He is supposed to have gone to Moscow to discuss the building of Trump Tower. It has never come to be. And so Leonard Lauder is the son of Estee Lauder, and she is a friend of Roy Cohn. Leonard Loudon's brother is Ronald Loudon, who is a childhood friend of Donald Trump, and also the head of the World Jewish Congress, and of course, another buddy of Netanyahu. So Trump gets invited to Russia in 1987, goes to Moscow, and he comes back to New York, and he announces, no, there's no Trump Tower is going to be erected. Instead, he's decided that he's going to run for president. And the person who's encouraged him is Roy Cohn, and working with him to publicize his announcement is Roger Stone. And that's the beginning of their collaboration to make Donald Trump president. So that begins again with Roy Cohn, Roger Stone, Paul Manafort, Ronald Lauder, and Arthur Finkelstein.
And you're saying that basically Trump grew up within this group, like childhood friends with the Lauder family.
Yes.
And at what point in Trump's life did he get involved with Roy Cohn?
Roy Cohn is the arch, villain. He's everywhere. So when we talk about the birth of the John Birch Society, you really have to talk about the American Jewish League Against Communism. And this is a Sabbatarian organization of Jews against communism. It was founded by a student of Rabbi Weiss. So there's a few known Sabbatarians in modern U.S. history. So there's Felix Frankfurter, there's the Warburg family, there's Brandeis, and I can't remember who else, and there's Stephen Weiss, Rabbi Stephen Weiss. So his student founds the other family, the other known Sabbatean family is the Bernard Baruch family. Bernard Baruch's grandfather, Kuttner Baruch, was one of the original members of the Klan, along with Walter P. Benjamin, another Zionist Jew who was also one of the early founders of the Klan. So where are we talking about? And of course,
we were talking about the American Jewish League Against Communism, the history of John Birch.
Right. So the AJALC was the group that was responsible, first of all, for the McCarthy era. Right, they're the ones who got Roy Cohn appointed as McCarthy's assistant, and all these guys were the ones who were responsible for. They were all very closely connected with. They're all like half of them were also members of the John Birch Society, and they were the ones who. So really where this to go to where Trump goes back to is Barry Goldwater. So the AJLC combined with the John Birch Society, or the AJLC in particular, helped found the National Review that was headed by William F. Buckley, Knight of Malta. And so they basically what happened is in those days, the South was Democratic, right? So the Klan was with the Democratic Party. But then the Dixiecrat movement basically started to challenge. I'm gonna have trouble getting the story exactly straight, but the Dixiecrat movement, headed by Jerome Thurman in the 50s, late 40s, started to rebel, started to try to make like a more racist wing of the Democratic Party and try to separate from the more conventional Democratic Party. What happened is that in 1963, I believe, is when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. Then everything blew up. And they said, that's it. The Democratic Party doesn't represent us anymore. So then they started flipping to the Republican Party. And one of the first ones that they fell behind was Barry Goldwater. He was Jewish, and he was a 33rd degree Mason, and used the Southern strategy, appeal to the John Birch Society, all the Klan language to gain support. So that's really where it begins. And so that's where this whole modern right that leads up to Trump, it begins with Barry Goldwater. Next guy after him is George Wallace, the guy who said segregation forever, backed by the Klan, backed by the Liberty Lobby, the John Birch Society, the whole kit and caboodle. So it's out of there that you get that network that comes to. So when you look at a guy like Roger Stone, all these guys, Arthur Finkelstein, they all started off with the Young Americans for Freedom, which was founded by William F. Buckley and Marvin Liebman, who was a member of the AJLC.
Right. So when Trump went to Moscow for the first time, do you think that he was already in contact with these guys?
Yes. I don't think there's any doubt. So do you think that then, and perhaps this is more speculation, but do you think, that Trump was chosen from a very early point in his career to eventually end up being a frontman for this movement? Well, this is not something that I try to prove, that I've seen evidence for, but it's my suspicion. Uh-huh. I think when you hear Trump talk about his genes, he seems to think that he was somehow well placed. I believe that it's been planned for a long time that he would probably serve that purpose. There must be some genealogy there or something like that. I'm not sure.
Because he does talk about his mother being descended from Scottish royalty. So if you get far enough back into Scottish royalty, which I found that in my own genealogy, you certainly get Scottish Rite Freemasonry pretty quickly.
Right. Yeah. What's really curious too is that another one of his mentors was with the guy who the positive thinking, power of positive thinking. And that guy, he's also deep into this entire fascist history. He was a core member of what's called the family.
Norman Vincent Peale.
Norman Vincent Peale, thank you. Right? So positive thinking, so the guy's a Freemason. Positive thinking is basically a form of self-hypnosis or neurolinguistic programming. It all goes back to the same thing, right? And so as I was mentioning, he was a core member of the Fellowship. So there's this far right Christian group. So even behind LeSec, even behind John Birch Society, all these organizations is the Fellowship. These are the guys who are the first fascist organization that first used Christianity as a Trojan horse to carry forward their neoliberal agenda.
And they're called the Fellowship?
Yeah, the Fellowship or the family.
Now, is this related to the family cult, also sometimes known as the Children of God?
No.
Okay. So, and then what are the origins of the fellowship? Did this also come out of Freemasonry and Zionism?
There's no obvious connections. They're basically just they start with a guy named Abram Variety, a fascist, a friend of Henry Ford, a friend of Billy Graham, another 33rd degree Mason. Billy Graham is another character who was there all along the way as well too.
Right.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a couple of conspiracy theories floating around there that I'm sure you would have heard of? I'd be interested to get your opinion. One of them is Barbara Bush being Aleister Crowley's daughter.
His daughter, yeah. Maybe, I don't know.
You see, at least give that one a maybe.
Well, yeah, I don't know. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think it matters a great deal, actually, and you know, to me, looking at the photos, it certainly looks plausible. It's worthy of investigation, but it also relates to this other one, which is about the Bush-Scherf connection. Have you heard that?
Yeah, that's garbage.
I think that one's garbage.
I finally contacted that guy, and it's just total gibberish.
Okay, well that's
things about George Bush working with Tesla and it being like the model for what was the comic or something like that. Just total nonsense. Like he has a picture of this guy who's supposed to be Skorzeny, doesn't look like anything like him. You know. Anyway, just yeah.
Yeah, no, I didn't think that picture looked too much like Skorzeny. And so maybe another one then, while we're sort of on that topic, is the infamous Pike-Mazzini letter predicting the 3 world wars.
Right. So that's an interesting one. So what's confusing there is that Carr was talking about two things. He was talking about a letter, and he was paraphrasing what Albert Pike's predictions supposedly were. So this supposed letter in the Library of Congress does not exist, and so that is where the issue is. So, and that's the portion where he predicts the unleashing of quote unquote the nihilists. As for the prediction of the 3 world wars, that's paraphrasing, and that's where he supposedly got from somewhere else. So, you know, the thing is, it's pretty amazing for a guy who wrote in 1954 to have predicted exactly what's happening. And I'll grant him that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's clear that there has been a plan. So, did that person get access to hints of the plan? You know, it's certainly not beyond the realms of possibility.
Yeah, no, and I mean, you know, the funny thing is that the war against Islam was prescribed by Saint Adalbert, the founder of Synarchism. So that was way back in 1890 something.
Right.
You know?
Can we just come back to the Discordians for a second, because you know I see them playing an enormous role in the modern world on the internet. Yeah. How did they sort of come about, and how have you been able to link them to the Fascists International?
Well, this is a story that's really just so strange. So if you look at all the characters, the AJLC, John Birch Society, the founders of the America First Committee, the Shikshini Knights, and then all the all the libertarian philosophers like Murray Rothbard and Chodorov and all these guys, they all they all come together in what's called the Freedom School. And the Freedom School is started by a guy named Robert Lefebvre. And he, before that, was a member of the Silver Shirts. So the Silver Shirts are really bizarre because they are a fascist order, but they're run by William Dudley Paley, who was in contact with his spirit guides. And they're the ones who inspired him to found the Silver Shirts. So also out of the Silver Shirts, you get George William Hunt, who's one of the first UFO contactees, him and George Adamski. And so George Williamson Hunt then becomes a channeler for Andrea Puharich, who's working with Aldous Huxley. And what I found out, which is really amazing, is that Aldous Huxley and Teilhard de Chardin were part of a society for the study of human progress or something like that, that was founded by Jean Cousteau, who's the author of the Synarchist Pact.
Wow.
Yeah. So Robert Lefebvre starts out from the silver shirts and then goes out to create the Freedom School. And all the top libertarian philosophers teach there. And there's two important students that come out of that school. One of them is one of the Koch brothers.
Wow.
And the other is Carrie Thornley, the founder of Discordianism.
Right. Wow. So, and were they at the school at the same time?
And I don't think so. Also connected to it indirectly is, of course, Robert Anton Wilson,
Right.
who is also a member of the Illuminates of Thanateros with William S. Burroughs and Timothy Leary, an order of chaos magic.
Yeah.
And Robert Anton Wilson is regularly published on the Mises Institute website, which is supposed to be like the publication of the libertarian movement.
Now, you earlier on, I can't remember who it was in relation to, but you mentioned the Martinist order, and that's something that I actually came across in my research into Burning Man. A guy called Timothy O'Neill, also known as Elder Mech, was the original founder of Wicker Man burning parties on the beach in San Francisco that then became Burning Man. He came out of the Martinist order, and he's connected into this chaos magic, the Illuminates of Thanateros type stuff. And you can certainly see the philosophies and threads of those people carrying through to Burning Man, and then basically being used to deliver the internet to us. With the same characters, with the Timothy Learys of the world. And looking back at some of the earlier hacker publications and magazines, like Mondo 2000, and then that's out of that sort of spun Wired magazine. But there was this kind of cultural crew in the Bay Area that brought together the technology industry, black magic, chaos magic. They're probably all tied to Bohemian Grove, and many writers, magazine authors, creators of the counterculture, all working together.
They're all libertarians too, right? The founders of the Wired magazine are libertarians. But there's an excellent article called "The California Ideology," which shows the libertarian roots of the. So basically, it's like this, and that's why you have transhumanist libertarianism or something like that, techno libertarianism, right? So that whole culture, that whole Silicon Valley culture, is ultimately a melding of Discordianism and libertarianism.
Yeah, and then where they're taking it now is, this transhumanism is not just about that we're being able to, to live longer because we replace our organs bionically. They're very much pushing the religious aspect to it now, that, Silicon Valley see themselves as they are creating gods, and that we are going to then merge with these godlike creations that we make, and in that process become God. And that seems to be the same kind of philosophy as the Kabbalists, right?
It's one and the same. The other interesting aspect is the pranksterism, which is how the prankster culture, particularly of 4chan, was used to help develop a base for Donald Trump.
Yeah, and I've got into this a little bit in some of my previous shows, like looking at mimetic warfare, and 4chan has basically been used as the staging ground for meme warfare, but the science of meme warfare has been very heavily studied and developed by the military, and that's something in an enormous amount of detail that they've done it. But so you can see a cultural thread from the merry pranksters of the 60s to the 4chan culture of today.
Organism. So the thing is, they follow the concept of the trickster archetype, and this is an idea that goes back to Carl Jung, who was a secret Shabbat Kabbalist.
Right.
And so the concept, basically, the trickster is Satan, and in what they see is that throughout history, there's been this archetype who is a sort of a jester, and leading to the royal order of jesters. That's what discordism, right? It's basically the prankster archetype. It's the idea that the jester is the only one who's able to mock the king to his face without getting his neck cut. So the way they see it is that mockery is a way of jolting people into questioning their paradigms. So that's why when ultimately what they want people to believe is that there is no truth, right? So when if you look at the order of subgenius, and the whole concept is to make fun of everything, to sort of induce people to give up believing in anything. So this is why, this has been taken to the internet, to 4chan in particular, and I'm not sure how conscious these guys are of it, but they've been infected by it. And it's this prankster culture. And unfortunately, it's nihilistic, and ultimately, without their knowing, a lot of them is ultimately fascistic. So Trump is a prank. Trump is the Discordian Antichrist. Right? He's the ultimate joke. And if you look at the language of a lot of these guys who are participated in this 4chan culture, they admitted so themselves. There's a great article called Great Meme War on the internet that quotes these guys, that basically, the reason why they voted for Trump or backed Trump is because they thought he was a joke.
Yeah, well, I think I could also see in Trump's sense of humor that he sort of has a bit of that Discordian element of mocking and trolling. Yep. So, let me ask you this straight up.
He's the ultimate troll.
Is Trump a Discordian?
Well, no, but he's a nihilist, right? I was just thinking on my way over here that Trump is the Nietzschean Superman. Right? It kind of gets back to my point earlier about the Antichrist. The Antichrist will be an insane clown. Right? He's the one who affirms that there's no truth. Like, Trump says whatever he feels like saying with no fear of consequences. You present the facts, it doesn't matter. He'll deny that they're correct. Right? And I think that fundamentally, and this goes back to Norman Vincent Peale, which is this whole idea of positive thinking, of like, never question yourself. Always keep moving forward, always deny. That it doesn't matter what you say. Nietzsche's Superman is supposed to be the man who creates his own truth, right? Who can let go of all slave morality, which is, Christianity or any kind of traditional belief system, and create his own reality. He called it positive nihilism, right? So nihilism is basically, you look at the void, the abyss, and then you panic. But positive nihilism is you look at the void and you embrace it. You embrace the chaos. You don't get intimidated by conflict of information, but just embrace chaos and just go with it. And so Trump is very much he's pretty good at that. That's one thing I compliment him on. Like that stunt the other day with Kanye West in his office is just he's carrying this entire conspiracy to a point of absurdity, which is far beyond anything I could have ever imagined. And I think that ties in very much to discordism. It's the society of the spectacle, isn't it? And he's the master of the spectacle. Yeah. It's because it's like nothing matters, right? Nothing is true and everything is permitted.
But why do you think there are so many that seem to be standing against Trump?
So many.
So many in terms of from the the establishment. Like when Trump rose to power, we had the leaders of all the countries in the world. We had the popes. We certainly all of the media coverage of Trump's that we get over here in New Zealand seems to be pretty negative.
I don't know. That's what I've been posting on my Facebook page. People wonder why I'm posting articles from the New York Times and Politico and Washington Post, and these publications are not so controlled that they can invent facts. They distort context. So I'm waiting to see what this means. It's undeniable. A lot of what they're revealing is undeniably true. So the question is, why are they revealing it? And the answer.
Well, I think we're certainly seeing the Operation Mockingbird media moving as one block. And then Trump has his own media, with Alex Jones being a example of that. So maybe it's like a Mockingbird 2, and there's sort of a factional war going in, amongst the intelligence community, that the old guard is against them and are using their old tools, and he's sort of aligned himself more with the rise of the new guard.
I don't know. We'll have to see. The thing about this, Fascists International, it's been on the sidelines this whole time. It's been slowly trying to gain power. It's never really, there's a fascinating explanation by Abe Foxman, who's used to be head of ADL, and there's an Israeli filmmaker who does a documentary on anti-Semitism. So he interviews the ADL, because the ADL is, the prime fabricator of this notion of a anti-Semitic problem. And so at one point, Abe Foxman is meeting all these international leaders. So the filmmaker asks him, like, why do they want to talk to you? Like, what is it about you that's so attractive? And he said it's something like this. He said, Jews are not as powerful. Jews are not as powerful as think they are, and not quite as powerful as Jews think they are. He said, somewhere in between.
Right.
And he said that. He said, like, how do you fight this idea of conspiracy without using it? Right. So the idea of spreading idea of a Jewish conspiracy. This is not my interpretation, right? This is what Foxman is implying, is that it helps to create the image that Jews are more powerful than they are, which they need, both for both sides of the operation, both to wield power and to also create the anti-Semitism that helps their agenda from the other side.
Right.
So from what I'm seeing, I'm starting. Well, I don't know. The thing is, what the mainstream media. I don't think it's so much unified as much as that's just the information as it's coming out, but they are still not really giving the full story. They're not talking about the connection of discordianism. They're not talking about the clan origins of the America First Committee. They're not talking about Boris Brassel right? It's a very sort of a narrow, convenient explanation that isolates Russia as the villain, when really it's Israel that's behind it all. And Netanyahu is really the architect, and Netanyahu and Kissinger are the real architects behind this whole thing.
Yeah, and Israel not being the top of the pyramid, because Israel was set up by the Freemasons.
Well, I mean, Freemasons are a creation of Kabbalistic Jews. So
There you go. So we go back to the Sabbatarians again, I guess.
Yeah.
Let me just ask you something, David. You mentioned the Lauder family, and the guy was the head of the World Jewish Congress, which I thought was sort of interesting, because the more recent head of the World Jewish Congress was Edgar Bronfman, who was tied up through his family in the Nexium cult, with his daughters actually hacking into his computer for a year to read and review all of the emails of the head of the World Jewish Congress. And then you have Roger Stone again. He was an advisor and lobbyist for Nexium. So I just wonder if there is some sort of, battle going on at the higher levels of these organizations, where the Bronfmans have been on the list to be taken down, possibly the Clintons on the list to be taken down, but it doesn't look like anything's going to be happening to Bushes or Rothschilds or Rockefellers or any of those guys.
Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were old buddies. Right? If you go back a couple of years ago, he called her brilliant, known her for years. She's going to go down in history as a queen. One thing is for sure, she's going to go down in history as a great Secretary of State, blah, 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 blah. Attended each other's weddings, right? So, you look at half the people who were against Trump now are like fully support him. So it's not like it's all a big charade.
I think that definitely it's a charade. I think politics has always been a charade, and I think it's impossible to become the president of the United States without having political factions that support you that you have to appease.
Well, that's how. Yeah.
But is it going to lead to the world burning up in a catastrophic nuclear war? I'm not sure, because in terms of the outcomes of the Book of Revelation and what they're really trying to achieve, it can be seen metaphorically, right? That it could be achieved through technology and through evolution.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that both Trump and Putin are the perceived messiahs of the Shabbat Lubavitchers, and that seems to be what it comes. It's all about rebuilding the third temple, right? So what is Freemasonry all about? It's about rebuilding the third temple, right? The great work is preparing the stage for the rebuilding of the Temple of Solomon. That's why they're called Masons. And
you have with Trump kind of the ultimate master builder.
I suppose, yeah. But I mean, essentially, that's why they're referring to him as a new Cyrus. Right? And so if you look, Trump has had, I mean, I don't think there's that particular faction of the Jewish community has never given so much support for a president as Donald Trump. Right? Netanyahu is just thrilled. The whole Shabbat community is thrilled. They see him as both him and Putin as the Messiah, who are bringing the opportunity to rebuild the third temple. Right. The first step was to move the embassy to Jerusalem. Right?
Yeah, that seems like a pretty major move, as well as $1 billion construction project. So it's going to be.
Messiah can't return until the third temple is built, and that's what their plan is.
Yeah, and I'd say they're probably going to need a second term for Trump for him to get the chance to do that.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
Well, David, this has been such a fantastic chat. Thank you so much. You've connected an incredible amount of dots for me, and you just have such a wonderful grasp on this picture of world history and how it pertains to current events. Where can people go to find more of your work?
My website at conspiracyschool.com. I post mainly to Facebook as well too. So on my website, there's a link to my Facebook page. People are welcome to sign up, and that's where I post most of my recent articles and comments and links to things that I discover. That's kind of where my online conversation happens.
Great. And your new book, Auto Ab Chao, when can we expect that to be out?
Soon, I hope. I thought I was close. I thought I was almost done about 2 years ago. So I soon is all I can say without making an empty promise.
Okay, fantastic. Well, David Livingstone, thank you very much, and great talking to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Steve.
Cheers, man. See ya.